The ending of Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Tlön, Uqbar, Orbus Tertius, shifts us from what's sort of like a examination of an interesting puzzle and an imaginary or a fantastical project and world into something much more, we could say, foreboding or chilling in its application of all of this other stuff that he's talked about throughout the story to the world that we know, the world that we share with the author Borges. And now this is happening a long time ago, so obviously not really something that happened in our world, but we could think of analogies. We can think of similarities to things in our own time that Borges perhaps didn't even imagine that could produce a somewhat similar result. So he is going to talk, and this is in the postscript in 1947, about ways in which this imaginary fictional world of Tlön begins to slowly invade our own, to infiltrate it, to modify it, to exert a kind of effect on it, which allows ultimately our world to be, in one of the terms that he uses, disintegrated into Tlön, no longer Earth. And he talks about two intrusions of Tlön into our own real world happening before a sort of general cultural shift. So he mentions in 1942 the plot thickened. I recall with singular clarity one of the first events that occurred, something of whose premonitory nature I believe I sensed even then. It took place in an apartment on La Prida, across from the street from a high, bright balcony that faced the setting sun. Princess Faucigny Lukind had received from Poitiers a crate containing her silver table service. And they pull all these bits out from Utrecht and Paris. And then they find, interestingly, among the pieces, trembling softly but perceptibly like a sleeping bird, there throbbed mysteriously a compass. The princess didn't recognize it. This is actually an artifact from Tlön. Its blue needle yearned towards magnetic north. Its metal casing was concave. The letters on its dial belonged to one of the alphabets of Tlön. That was the first intrusion of the fantastic world of Tlön into the real world, we learn. Then the second is talked about at a little bit more length. There is a young man who actually they don't realize is young until they find him dead. And they're in a country general store and bar owned by a Brazilian man in the Cochilha Negra. And he and a friend were returning from Santa Ana. So they stay there and they're kept awake until dawn by the drunkenness of an unseen neighbor who swung between indecipherable streams of abuse and loudly sung snatches of milongas, or snatches of the same milonga actually. So they go out and the man is dead in the hallway. He's a young man. Several coins had slipped from his wide gaucho belt, as had a gleaming metal cone. And this is going to be a really key thing. A gleaming metal cone about a die's width and diameter. So very, very small, right? Die is a single of dice. A little boy tried to pick up the cone-shaped object, but in vain. A full-grown man could hardly do it. I held it for a few minutes in the palm of my hand. I recall its weight was unbearable. Even after someone took it from me, the sensation of terrible heaviness endured. So he talks about maybe we should get rid of it. His friend purchases it for a few pesos. Nobody knew anything about the dead man except that he came from the border. So he's, essentially a nobody. What's important about this? Those small, incredibly heavy cones made of a metal not of this world are an image of the deity in certain Tlönian religions. So now we have two different artifacts ostensibly coming from Tlön. Now the compass, of course, okay, it could be that secret society, they've come up with the language, and so they put it in the letters and all that. That's fine. The cone is a little bit harder to explain. It's unbearably heavy. It's made of a metal, not of this world. So how the hell did it get here, right? And then the narrator goes on and he says, well, I don't have to tell you any more of these stories. Here ends the personal portion of my narration. The rest lies in every reader's memory, if not their hope or fear. Some people are welcoming Tlön, other people are scared of this, but we all know what has been going on in the narrative world of this story, right? So he says, I'll just mention a few subsequent events with a simple brevity of word. So what do we find first? 40 volumes of the first Encyclopedia of Tlön are found in a Memphis library. And now this is the full set, not just one volume. And there are cuts or expurgations or mutings, downplayings of things, right? He says some of the unbelievable features of Volume 11, the multiplication of Tlön, for example, have been eliminated or muted in the Memphis copy. Why? Well, we don't really know, but it seems reasonable to suppose the cuts obey the intent to set forth a world that is not too incompatible with the real world, with the world that we currently live in. So this secret society that has been preparing this imaginary, fantastical world is exercising a kind of judiciousness in introducing it. And what happens next? The spread of Tlönian objects all over the place in multiple countries, no longer just an odd one here, an odd one there, a whole bunch of them throughout the world. And we get a sort of reduplication of aspects of Tlön in literary ways throughout our world as well. He talks about handbooks, anthologies, surveys, literal translations, in quotes, right? It's not really literal translations. Authorized and pirated reprints of mankind's greatest masterpiece, the Tlönian Encyclopedia, filled the world and still do. Now, what does this end up leading to? Is this just sort of like a hobby, a fandom, something like that? No. Reality, as he says, caved in and gave way to Tlön. So we can ask, well, why would reality cave in? And he says the truth is it wanted to cave in. Now, is that reality like objective, cold, clear reality apart from us? No, the reality that we share as human beings. He says 10 years ago, any symmetry, any system with an appearance of order, so think of 1937, dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, could spellbind and hypnotize mankind. How could the world not fall under the sway of Tlön? How could it not yield to the vast and minutely detailed evidence of an ordered planet? It would be futile, he says, to reply that reality is also orderly. Perhaps it is, but orderly in accordance with divine laws, read in human laws, we can never quite manage to penetrate. And this is where it gets particularly important. Tlön, he says, is a labyrinth, but it is a labyrinth forged by men. Human beings produced it, the secret society, a labyrinth destined to be deciphered by men. Not only the secret society, everybody else. So it has a coherence that even those isms didn't have, a potential for colonizing and then turning our world into itself, sort of like a virus in a way. And he says that contact with Tlön, the habit of Tlön, has disintegrated this world. Spellbound by Tlön's rigor, humanity is forgotten and continues to forget. It is the rigor of chess masters, not angels. And he gives some examples of this. Already Tlön's primitive language is filtered into our schools. The teaching of Tlön's harmonious history has obliterated the history that governed my own childhood. A fictitious past is supplanted in men's memories, that other past of which we now know nothing certain, not even that it is false. Numismatics, the study of coins, right? Pharmacology and archaeology have been reformed. I understand that biology and mathematics are also awaiting their next avatar. So, Tlön has now become our reality, and it has been obliterating and supplanting the reality that we thought was our own, at least in this story, right? He says that a scattered dynasty of recluses has changed the face of the earth, and their work continues. And the narrator projects that 100 years from now, they'll find 100 volumes of the second encyclopedia of Tlön, which might be written in the Tlönian languages if we go by what was said earlier in the story. So, to recap, a bunch of people got together with a crazy project that took centuries to develop of producing an imaginary world that is different, but not too different from our own, which then takes over our own reality and supplants it. Why? Because it is so developed, so coherent, so gripping for human beings who desire order in the cosmos and their thoughts. If we wanted to stray outside of this book, we could say that the problem of the absurd that Albert Camus talks about in the myth of Sisyphus, the disconnect between human desires and rationality and a world that doesn't conform to those, has in some respect been overcome, at least in theory, by Tlön and the massive project that it represents. So that is where the story ends, a rather foreboding conclusion. Could this happen in our world? Well, Borges leaves that to us to ponder.